Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CCAG Climate Conversation. I'm your host, Mitzi Jonelle Tan, a climate justice activist from the Philippines. Today, we spotlight one of the most overlooked pieces of the climate crisis puzzle, methane. While most public discussions around climate change focus on carbon dioxide, methane is a greenhouse gas that's far more potent in the short term. In fact, methane is responsible for roughly 30% of the current rise in global temperatures, yet the role of methane is still not widely understood and global action so far has been limited. And that's why this conversation is so important. And we're here to unpack why methane matters, what sets it apart from other emissions, and what targeted action on methane emissions could mean for our climate future. I'm honored to be joined by two incredible guests today, Dr. Christophe McGlade, CCAG member and head of the Energy Supply Unit at the International Energy Agency, and Marcelo Mena, CEO of the Global Methane Hub and a longtime advocate for environmental health and climate justice. Marcelo, thank you so much for being with us today. For those who may not be as familiar, can you explain why methane is such a critical and often overlooked part of the climate conversation?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. So the methane has contributed to between a third and half of the warming. It's short-lived. So therefore, if we want to stop its warming effect, if we take action on this, its warming effect will disappear much faster than carbon dioxide. So it allows us to reduce temperature in the short term as we start seeing the reductions of carbon dioxide in their own reductions of temperature. The important thing about it is that in the short term, it's roughly 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So even if I burn a molecule of methane, it will reduce its warming potential significantly. And so therefore, it's the fastest way to reduce temperature in the short term. And as we're heading into the climate crisis and we want to reduce temperature fast, this is the way to do it with methane mitigation as a priority.
That's a really mind-blowing fact that the warming effect can be reduced faster. And so, Christophe, I wanted to ask you, because the IEA recently came out with its annual global methane tracker. What are the main sources of methane emissions today? And are there sectors or activities that we should be most concerned about, especially when we're talking about the methane mitigation that Marcelo was talking about?
Yes, certainly. Thanks very much, Mitzi. At the IEA, we look at all of the different sources of methane emissions, and there's really three key sectors when it comes to methane emissions from human activity. First of all, we have the agriculture sector. Secondly, we have the waste. And secondly, we have the energy sector. And we are the International Energy Agency, and so we focus a lot on those methane emissions coming from the energy sector. And roughly speaking, about 1/3 of the methane emissions from human activity comes from the extraction of oil, natural gas, and coal, and then also the way that that's transported and used. So natural gas, for example, it's just methane. When you pull it up out of the ground, there's a few leaks that can occur. As you transport it through pipelines, some leaks can occur. As you get it to people's homes for heating, for using for cooking, using in industrial processes, you can also get methane leaks. When you put all of that together, you get a very, very large amount of methane emissions. Another big source of methane emissions today is from old oil, gas, and coal infrastructure. So when we were extracting many, many years ago, we drilled the wells for oil and gas, we developed the coal mines, and in many cases, those have been abandoned. They might have been abandoned well, in which case they don't leak too much methane, but in many cases, the oil and gas and coal facilities weren't abandoned particularly well. And that means that they leak small amounts of methane emissions over time. And actually, we've drilled thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these oil and gas wells around the world. And you add up all of these and you get quite a large amount of methane emissions. And the reason that we place so much emphasis on the energy sector and reducing methane emissions from the energy sector, for the reasons that Marcelo mentioned, it's, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, but also when it comes to the fossil fuel sector, it should be relatively easy to reduce many of these emissions. We know how to do it. The technologies are all there. We know how to produce oil and gas and coal without releasing methane emissions. And actually, in many cases, it's very, very cheap to reduce them. So the near-term opportunities that exist for reducing methane, we're thinking here about what the energy sector can be doing and what the oil and gas industry and what governments around the world should be doing to help pull down those emissions in the future.
Thank you, Christophe. That really makes me, really emphasizes to me the importance of the methane conversation that we were saying earlier, where as we're reducing our fossil fuel industries today, we have to make sure that we're also looking at the methane, because as you said, the old sources of oil and gas and coal are some of the biggest sources of methane today. And so we have to make sure that it's all really like sealed up tight. And as we transition away, we don't let any of these like loopholes almost keep going. And you already talked a little bit about why it's so important, but could you tell us a little bit more of the near-term benefits of reducing methane emissions?
So there's two key benefits. First of all, as Marcelo mentioned, methane is really, really potent. When you emit a ton of methane, it's way more potent. It results in a much higher temperature rise than is the case for a ton of CO2. And so if we can reduce methane in the near term, that will have an immediate impact on the temperature rise. We're already getting close to about a 1.5 degree temperature rise around the world, the limit that the world set itself. And if we can reduce methane, we can probably pull that number down. Now, that doesn't substitute for reducing CO2 emissions. We should never think that, are we going to do CO2 emissions or are we going to do methane emissions? We have to do both of them together. But if we can bring about those reductions in methane emissions, that can buy us a little bit more time to bring about the overall reductions that we need in CO2 emissions. There's other good reasons to reduce methane. As I mentioned, methane is just natural gas. In many, many parts of the world, they don't have access to energy today. They don't have access to clean cooking facilities. They don't have access to electricity. And in many of those countries, they actually have large methane emissions. They're flaring large amounts of natural gas, or they're letting the gas leak to the atmosphere. And if they can cut down on that methane, in many cases, that can help provide energy to people. It can help reduce some of the tensions that there currently are. So there's a real climate benefit for cutting down on methane emissions, but there's also this additional security and economic benefits that you can get from cutting down on methane.
Yeah, it really is this just transition issue, ensuring that we have that justice aspect, making sure that it's not CO2 or methane, but ensuring that it's both, so that we can ensure that global South countries can also develop and that we don't lose that in the process. And as you said, having energy democracy and having access to energy, and what would it look like to reduce these methane emissions by giving people electricity through solar, because a lot of these global South countries also have a lot of like the sun, the water, like the resources for renewable. And Marcelo, your organization focuses on accelerating these methane reductions. Can you give us some examples that of rapid progress already being made?
Mm-hmm. I just came from a week in China, and China has committed, along with the U.S., to include methane for the first time in its climate targets at the highest level, at the President Xi's level. And since they did their methane action plan almost 2 years ago, they have enacted a whole bunch of different measures. First is coal. Half of coal emissions from methane in the world are from China, and they're associated to a type of coal that's going to stay around longer, which is metallurgical coal that you use to make steel. It's a higher quality coal that has higher methane emissions. And so they did it for multiple reasons. They started doing it because of safety. These mines were exploding. There are around 300 people that would die from explosions, the canary in the coal mine, literally. And therefore, they're extracting that methane to make the mine safer. But now they're powering the extraction systems with the methane they're capturing, and they've established maximum percentage of methane that could be ventilated. And then they established an emission trading scheme to be able to reduce the smaller concentrations. So that's significant. And Lawrence Berkeley National Lab estimates they could reduce their methane emissions in half, which is in turn a fourth of all the coal methane emissions at once. So it's a significant reduction of temperature. So that's a great sign of progress. And they also have livestock emissions regulation for companies, in which they ask to report these emissions and show how much kilograms of methane is per liter of milk or beef or wool. So this is pretty interesting, because this does not happen necessarily in the places that we live. The third is that they're capturing the methane from landfills. And so they have made rules so that those methane emissions from landfills that end up bringing bad air with it, foul air, usually impacting low low-income communities, we could prevent all these things. The thing that brings it all together is that we could track this from space. So the same reason why it's much more potent than carbon dioxide, it means that also you are able to see it very distinctly from a satellite. So therefore, you're able to detect those leaks, quantify those emissions, and then check later if these emissions were accounted for or not, if they persist. And we could estimate things that bring it all together. One methane leak at 5 tons an hour, which is very frequent, is equivalent in the short term to 2.5 coal-fired power plants. It's equivalent to almost 1 million cars in one place. It's $5 million of lost revenue. So whichever story you want to hear, lost revenue, climate, or impacts to local communities, it all is brought together by the information that is available today with the satellites from this new era of accountability on methane emissions.
Thank you, Marcelo. And I really love the emphasis on how it's the corporations. So in terms of agriculture, it's the industry and the corporations that are given the onus to reduce the methane emissions, because it's so often, especially around agriculture and food industries, we see a lot of the solutions only coming from the consumer side, but not so much from the production side. And so I'd love to hear more from how important and how crucial it is for the agricultural industry to address their methane emissions and the different ways that they could do this.
Yes, so we've helped with our colleagues from Environmental Defense Fund put together the Dairy Methane Action Alliance, and now the Rice Methane Action Alliance, because methane comes from livestock, from dairy, from beef, etc. And when you start dealing with it, not saying we want to be vegan and we want to replace cows and reduce herd sizes, things change very differently. The response when you're saying we want to fix this, it's a matter of fact that this causes methane, but it's also a matter of fact that cow burp is actually lost milk. If we could repurpose that to be more efficient, instead of if we feed an animal something that will not so won't spend all its energy in processing the food but actually producing milk, it's a win-win for the farmer. So we could improve the amount of milk that an animal is produced. In Kenya, on average 5 liters per day. You can't make ends meet with 5 liters per day. But if it's producing 30 liters per day, then you have the possibility for that income to be higher. And so therefore, a lot of things can be done. Is like the same cow will produce much more milk with the same methane. Reducing emissions intensity is a win-win. And so that kind of work we do, and that gets support from the farmers. And that way, groups like Danone and Nestle and Mars, who are part of the Dairy Methane Action Alliance, including Starbucks, they could work with farming communities to try to improve their productivity. The things that we're doing now on rice are very much aligned. Rice is produced because stagnated water, right? And we are able to produce rice that does not flood water and actually is done in an aerobic manner. We could reduce emissions and also the runoff from fertilizer, which also causes environmental impacts. And so if we're able to produce more rice with less water, it's again a win-win. And so therefore we can work with the corporations, but the corporations need to bring a case to the farmers that makes sense to them, right? That the solutions that we're preventing to them are actually going to use less water or make their milk production and their income increase. And so that changes completely when you become a judging vision, right? People eat meat, people drink milk and eat rice. And the solution, shouldn't ever be, less cows. It should be, how do we fix cows? Because in essence, yes, maybe I eat too much beef or drink too much milk, but there's many people that are actually not filling their nutrition demands. And there is a world in which me going down in my consumption and somewhere else increasing, we could have a middle ground in which we could have less methane emissions with more nutrition for the world. And that's the type of solution that we need to bring. Any other solution will just get us into this cultural war that really does not benefit anybody that wants action.
Yeah, thank you for that visual, Marcelo. I think it's a really powerful visual that you can bring in food, in energy, in almost everything, right? It's like some people in some countries, in some sectors of society really need to bring down, and a lot need to go up. And so we need to find that middle ground. And how do we get there? What kind of solutions do we create? What kind of industries and rules and laws do we put in place so that waste isn't happening when there's people who are starving, when there are people who don't have energy, when there are people who don't have clothes, when there are people who don't have water. Like, you can say that in so many different ways. I think I was more familiar with methane in natural gas terms, as Christophe was talking about, but I didn't realize that it was in rice, in water stagnation, and I mean, I realized it with the dairy, but not so much. And so, like, really understanding how prevalent methane and natural gas is, and what Christophe was saying earlier over and over, that natural gas is just methane, and it's mind-blowing to me almost, because suddenly the different sectors of climate activism or sustainability doesn't feel so removed, but are so connected by these same emissions. And so a question to both of you is, where should, with so many of these little sectors, little circles, do you have suggestions, or where should the global focus be to effectively cut down on methane, and how feasible are the methods and the strategies and the technologies that we need?
Certainly, Mitzi, I'm happy to start here, and again, I'm going to focus on the energy sector for obvious reasons. And one thing I think just it's worthwhile bearing in mind when we think about methane emissions from fossil fuel operations, there's sometimes this idea that we don't need to worry about it. What we should be focusing on is transitioning away from fossil fuels. And if we move away from oil, gas, and coal consumption, the methane problem will take care of itself. Now, first of all, we know that's not going to be the case, because if you don't abandon your wells and you don't kind of seal them up properly, you're going to get lots of methane leaks anyway. But also, there's no way we can move away from oil, gas, and coal fast enough to bring about the methane emission reductions that we require. If we put it very, very simply, unless we have targeted action on methane emissions from fossil fuels, we won't be able to achieve our climate objectives. We have to have targeted action by governments, by the industry, by others to help bring about these methane reductions. And the good news is that we don't need any massive new technology breakthroughs to do this. In our view, you can cut methane emissions from oil, gas, and coal by 75% just with the technologies that already exist today. And there's loads and loads of different things that can be done. But one of the most simple ones is simply to go out and look for the leaks. Lots of leaks occur that are accidental. Someone leaves a latch open in a tank, a bit of pipe work breaks and starts leaking, and you can't see it. You have to kind of get an infrared camera, or you have to get an aerial campaign, or you have to do something to look for those leaks. It's very often the case that once you detect the leak, you can fix it very quickly, because if it's a hatch, you just have to close the hatch. You just forgot about it. And so these processes are called leak detection and repair programs. It's about getting people to go out and look for leaks and then fix them very, very quickly. And that's incredibly powerful when it comes to reducing overall methane leaks. So it's an example of many companies already do this today. They produce oil and gas without large levels of methane leaks simply by introducing that kind of technology, that kind of measure, as well as many other kind of things that exist. We know that it's possible to produce oil and gas profitably without methane leaks. There are countries, there are companies that do it today, and it really comes down to the lack of policy action. You need to have firm regulations in place. You need to have the industry working very hard to bring about these reductions, because we know it can be done, because we know it can be done very, very cost effectively in many, many parts of the world. The reason it's not being done is because people aren't required to do it. And this is where policymakers really need to kind of step up. They need to step up with things like saying, you introduce leak detection and repair programs, you stop natural gas flaring, you have standards on your equipment that prevent leaks from happening. They can bring these regulations in. They can keep producing oil and gas. It doesn't shut down the industry by any means. And it stops those leaks from happening. And just bringing about these kind of tried and tested measures, policy measures, industry measures, that would have a huge impact. That would already kind of get us well on the way to the reductions that we need to see if we are to try to achieve our climate objectives.
Christophe, I wanted to ask you, on your report, you showed which countries, if you may say, or regions, have the highest percentage of leakage of their upstream oil and gas?
So, Marcelo, as you mentioned, we are getting more and more information from satellites in particular. Satellites has been kind of one of the big new technology development areas there's been over the past few years. And it's really shining a spotlight on parts of the world which we didn't have a huge amount of information about 5 or 6 years ago. And consistently, some of the big areas that we see are in Central Asia. So you have countries there, such as Turkmenistan, where there's huge leaks that are detected. Really, you mentioned 5 tons. These are kind of almost an order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude more in terms of the leaks that you're seeing. These are being detected. And one of the things that we see is when we look at some of the worst producers, and we compare them with the best producers, there's actually a factor of 100 difference between the best producers and the worst producers. So the best producers are countries such as Norway. Norway produces oil and gas without very large methane leaks. Turkmenistan is at the other end of the scale. Venezuela also produces oil and gas with very high methane leaks, and there's a factor of 100 difference between that. But countries like Norway show what can be done.
Yeah, and Venezuela is like around 6% plus of if not more. So just think about like how much money is being lost, right? Just as and so the thing is, that's why regulation is so important, because you don't get penalized because you lose $100 million, $200 million a year for your company. You don't get penalized because it just goes free. So that's why you have to have a regulation that makes that freedom to pollute disappear. The US still has a methane fee. You get a tax for every ton of methane. Or there's other ways of doing it, like, for example, if you want to access the European Union market, you must have a 0.2% leakage rate maximum, or you will have a different way of penalization, whether it's limitation to the access to market, whether it's a fine, there's some form. But without having this, we will not move forward, because you do not get penalized for, let's say you're going to pick apples at an orchard. You might drop a whole bunch of them, but you don't get penalized for losing them. You might take, the ones that you took. And so unless we change that fact, the short-term gains that oil companies want will make that loss invisible. But that loss is not invisible for climate. And so that's why this needs to be there should be a spotlight on it. And so the same way the IEA is showing at a country level what this is, we're arming a community of activists globally that are able to say, this leak in my neighborhood is exposing my community to benzene, and this is the revenue lost, and therefore this can be pressure for countries and to have regulations. And so that way, if you do get caught with that methane leak, you should get a fine. And that, and it will not be invisible. And a lot of the things that we're seeing changing in Turkmenistan and in Kazakhstan is the sheer fact that people know that they're going to be observed from abroad. So that's why we need to continue to put the pressure on this, because the same year that oil and gas companies committed to reducing their emissions recently, it's been only 16 months since they did that. They're already thinking about walking back some of these commitments, and we must remain vigilant to continue. And the European Union needs to stay strong, and keep those regulations in place, because by itself, it could help address nearly 15% of all the European Union's emissions, but they're actually being imported from the oil and gas that they buy. So these are very, very important things that open up many conversations. And of course, we're doing many other things on capturing methane from landfills and helping community. We need to do that too. And there's hundreds of cities that are working with us on this endeavor. We're working on reducing emissions from livestock emissions, and we're provided over $100 million in research funding to create a cow 2.0 that doesn't pollute. We're gonna do this for rice. But this decade, this 5 years, we need to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector 75%, and we're not on track. I was there recently on the World Gas Conference in Beijing, and the people from the oil and gas sector were saying, we need more oil, we need more gas. Net zero is going too fast. No, and we're doing so much on methane emissions. And as the beginning of the IEA report said, I paraphrased it, emissions remain stubbornly high. You promised you were going to reduce this, and you have 5 more years. Yeah, probably maybe 1 more year of goodwill from the people. But we need to have these emissions go down now, and we must demand governments to have regulations on this too.
Thank you both for such clear answers as well. And I want to touch a little bit on what you said, Marcelo, because a campaign that I'm working on is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is basically getting governments patterned after the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, getting governments to sign on to move away from fossil fuels, including methane and gas. And something that we usually use in our messaging is how the fossil fuel industry is a health crisis. And you mentioned it a little bit earlier, where there are communities that are talking about their exposure to benzene. Could you tell us a little bit more about the health impacts that communities experience because of methane?
Yeah, it's a great point. And so we need to provide a good pathway that actually is clear on the cost. And as we're heading to 40-50% of variable renewable energy, we need to be able to say what the rest of the 50% is going to be done in terms of reduction. But I'll tell you right away. So first off, the extraction of oil and gas, it has oil, right? And that oil has volatile organic compounds. And so we've been able to, with partners like the PSC Clean Energy, if you look them up, they're making methane map overlays that show the benzene exposure to local communities, because they know the composition of the oil and gas, and so they're able to model the exposure. So you could see in this map, whether that school that's right by the well is having high concentrations, and providing tools that can be used by communities to defend themselves and take it to court, because maybe climate change might not be important in a place in Texas, but health sure is. Other things that has to do with clean energy is some of the work that we funded in homes. So Rob Jackson, a professor at Stanford, started measuring that when you burn natural gas in a home, you actually start generating benzene. It's synthesized by the combustion. And so it comes at rates of having a smoker in your house. And we wouldn't have smokers in house in terms of benzene exposure, but we are when we're having this cook stove. And so therefore we replicated those studies in Colombia, in Brazil, and in Chile. And we found, even my own house, it was part of this testing ground. And this actually generates that benzene that could be bad for you. The NO2 emissions that also are powerful oxidants in your lungs. And so essentially it is like having a smoker in your house. Why wouldn't it be? You're having uncontrolled emission combustion inside a house. So of course it's better to take a cook stove that's from biomass burning into LPG and natural gas. Yes, but why would we want to follow a path that we could transition directly into the clean solution, right? And so therefore having decentralized solar systems with battery storage that are actually cheaper than diesel and gas and have much less volatility, then you could have potentially an electrified future. And I think that's the type of pathway that we need to present forward. But we can't do it being naive. We need to present it with lower energy costs. And the way that incumbents set up the electricity systems is that they always get the biggest share of the profits, whereas the renewable energy does not. And we need to shift the way that we design our energy systems. So, as a matter of fact, this cheapest source of energy that we have ever, according to the IEA, the cheapest source of energy that humanity has ever had, which is solar energy, really reflects what happens in the people's bills at the end of the day. Because it doesn't help us if it's the cheapest source of energy for new projects if it's not transferred to the people's lives that are having a cost of life that's more expensive. So that is a challenge that we need to address, and we can't be naive about it either.
Thank you, Marcelo. We have so much of the solutions already here, and we have so much of the regulations. And Christophe, you were also talking about how it is just lack of policy and lack of implementation and lack of regulations. And we saw at COP26, the Global Methane Pledge was launched, and it is designed to rapidly reduce methane emissions, and many countries actually signed up. But as you have both been saying, progress has been uneven. So Christophe, what do you think needs to be done to provide clearer guidance and expectations so countries can make more consistent progress?
Yeah, thanks, Mitzi. I mean, just to flag on the Global Methane Pledge. So this was about 155 countries now around the world have signed up to this. And they've signed up to reduce methane emissions by about 30% by 2030. So we're in about 5 years' time, all methane emissions from energy, from agriculture, from waste, all of the different things that Marcelo has been mentioning. And that's great. It's great that countries are making pledges. We've seen other national action plans by countries, like long-term pledges to reduce emissions. And in fact, if all of those pledges were to come together, we would see a very substantial reduction in methane emissions. But the problem is that pledges haven't yet been underpinned by real policies. So those pledges, if they all came together, we estimate you'd reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector by about 50%, which is good, but it's well on the way to the 75% that Marcelo mentioned. But actually, the real policies that countries have in place would only reduce by about 25%. So we're kind of only seeing about half of the action just to even achieve those pledges, and those aren't nearly ambitious enough yet to hit the targets that we need to hit our overall climate objectives. So the key thing we need to see is countries to move beyond just making pledges and long-term targets and really to about implementing them and embedding them within their countries. One of the big opportunities that exists for that this year is in the next round of nationally determined contributions. Countries are expected to produce their next NDC, as it's called, by as soon as possible. And methane can really form an important part of that. We've identified there's very many countries, about 65 countries, who've made a pledge on methane. And if they were just to include that pledge in their NDC and bring about these implementation measures, that would already mean a large step up in their overall ambition in terms of cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a big opportunity there this year in terms of policies. The other big thing that we are seeing, I mentioned it once already, but it's really worth drilling down on this point, is the new wave of transparency that we are seeing. Because of satellites, because of increased understanding of the nature of methane emissions, where they're occurring, how they're occurring, what can be done about them, we are seeing new opportunities here emerging. So Marcelo already mentioned that by shining a spotlight on where the methane emissions are occurring, countries and companies are saying, right, we need to do something about this. This problem is actually much worse than what we thought. And we see this repeated, this is repeated all the time. Companies, countries don't realize that they're emitting so much methane until they really go out and are told that they're leaking lots and lots of methane, or they go out into the field and look for that. Countries themselves are massively underreporting the amount of methane emissions that is occurring within their borders, and many companies are also underreporting. So this new wave of transparency, just by shining that spotlight, will almost certainly by itself help to underpin some of the reductions that we need to see. Global Methane Hub, which Marcelo leads, that's been very active in helping to push many of the satellites. We're seeing more and more satellites going up into orbit that can help inform on this. And really, very soon, there's not going to be any place to hide. We're going to know much better where methane emissions are occurring and who the best performers are and who the worst performers are.
Thank you so much, Christophe. And finally, Marcelo, given everything that we've already talked about in the importance of implementation, the importance of regulations, and now as transparency gets better, ideally, the government start to do something. So if you could deliver one message to policymakers, what would it be about the urgency and opportunity of acting on methane?
Yes, so we consider methane mitigation as part of the emergency brake solutions that are ones that help us reduce temperature faster than any other way. So methane has contributed to roughly 0.5 degrees of warming, but other pollutants like black carbon and HFCs also have contributed. So they actually account for more than half of the pollution. And so if we're able to prioritize methane mitigation, we have a chance to keep 1.5 alive. And as we're blowing past 1.5, there's a risk that countries will say, well, now our new target is 2 degrees, and then blow past 2 degrees again. And no, 1.5 is a reason. It's about the country's capacity to survive. There's some that will have irreversible impacts. People will be displaced. And so therefore, I think in the short term, we need to think about how we report methane and non-CO2 pollutants more explicitly. China for the first time is including all the greenhouse gases in their NDC. But if you look at other countries, they're not reporting these things well. And so if we're going to put all this in a blender and see whether our commitments are going to allow 1.5 to be met, we have no idea with the way that we report today. And so we need to change our reporting requirements and focus on short-term warming to see what measures we need to prioritize. And if we were to prioritize around we could reduce like 1 degree of temperature with measures that are actually cost negative if you add black carbon, HFCs, and methane. So we need to really have a new way of seeing this, an emergency brake protocol that prioritizes measures and reporting measures. Otherwise, we're just going to be blind. We're going to not know whether we're going to blow past 1.5. If we said, and I was part of the Paris Agreement, and probably one of the most powerful moments in my life, when we walked into the final plenary, locked in arms with the president, the chancellor, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Marshall Islands, when they put a pin made out of a palm from the island of Marshall Islands to say, if we don't get 1.5, our island disappears. If we are going to deliver on that promise, we must do everything, not say 1.5 is done and dead. We need to really take measures to reduce temperature and keep 1.5 alive, because that is the representation of the most vulnerable communities of this world. Whether it's Philippines, whether it's small island states, whether it's Chile glaciers, it's about what is the most vulnerable to climate change. And we need to do everything in our means to keep 1.5 alive, prioritizing methane emission mitigation above all.
Thank you, Marcelo, especially on your point about survival in life. I think so often when we're talking about emissions and numbers and reductions, we forget that this is about people's lives today. That is about health. That is about the survival of our communities, our cultures, our experiences. And I really love what you said about methane is the emergency brake solution. And just to summarize our conversation today, I want the audience to remember that we cannot stay below 1.5 without reducing methane emissions. It's about life and survival. And as Christophe said earlier, it's not either or CO2 or methane, it's both. And what I'm really taking away from this conversation is we have the solutions. The IEA has already said before that we don't need new fossil fuel infrastructure. And now we also have very clear and concrete solutions for methane that as simple as leak detection programs. And now we have the transparency aspect coming in. So it's really about that policy implementation and making sure that governments actually put in those regulations and focus on methane reductions as well as the fossil fuel phase out. So thank you so much, Christophe and Marcelo, for your work. Thank you for joining us in this crucial conversation. You've really helped shine a light on this issue that urgently deserves more attention, more energy, and more action. Thank you for joining us. And to everyone watching this, until next time. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.